Whoa, welcome back to Bioactive. Today's episode is all about cannabis and metabolism. Cannabis clearly affects metabolism, as we see from examples like getting the munchies. But we're going to talk about this more in depth today in a broader context of eating disorders and obesity. Today's guest is Dr. Jonathan Fields, who is a physician and a board-certified herbalist. He recently authored a paper on the endocannabinoid system involvement in metabolism in the American Journal of Endocannabinoid Medicine. I know some of these topics can be difficult to discuss, and I'm passionate about this subject because I have suffered from an eating disorder for a very long time. Food is complicated, and food can be absolutely addicting. Food has significant impacts on our mental and physical well-being. And from my experience, I have found that cannabis can absolutely be a tool with helping regulate these systems, but also can be a hindrance in recovering from these conditions because it has such a profound effect on appetite and metabolism. Dr. Fields and I don't really get into the nitty-gritty of the munchies, so I'm adding 2 articles to the show notes of this episode that I have authored about the science of the munchies, one that was published on Weed Maps and one that was published in the magazine Fat Nugs, if you want to learn more. Thank you so much to the patrons of this podcast for your support. You can join the Bioactive Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You can get exclusive content, ask guests questions ahead of time, request topics that you're interested in, and of course, send me personal messages. If you want a free and easy way to support Bioactive, slam a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. It only takes 5 seconds and makes a massive difference. And thank you to everyone who has already done that and shared this podcast on social media. Also, I know a lot of people are struggling right now, myself included. So as you listen to this episode with me, relax your jaw, take a few deep breaths, bend and move your body in whatever way feels nice. Load up your bowl, roll up a J, and let's chill for the next hour and forget about all the other stuff that we have to do. And also, I love all the herbs behind you on that shelf.
Oh, thank you.
That's awesome looking.
It's actually my home office here.
Oh, very cool. I'm in my home office, too. I love it here. All right, cool. Well, welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. Today, I am so excited to talk to Dr. Jonathan Fields, and we're going to really focus on cannabis and metabolism. So I'm going to let Dr. Fields kind of give a background on the research that he's done in the past, what he currently does, and then we'll get into the conversation and talk about everything metabolism related.
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Jonathan Fields. I practice functional medicine. My doctorate and my master's are actually both in acupuncture and Eastern medicine. So I'm a board-certified herbalist. I've been into the Eastern medicine for about 20 years now. And I own a few clinics in South Florida. One is a acupuncture and functional medicine office. Another is an anti-aging facility that I own with my brother, who's an internal medicine doctor. So we have the best of East meets West there. That's Create Health. And we're actually in the process of opening a ketamine wellness center up in Delray Beach, Florida as well. And part of my research has been, my doctoral research was actually on diabetic neuropathy. So this has always been the metabolic field has always been a big fascination of mine, along with the functional medicine. A lot of what we deal with is digestive and metabolic disorders and how that can translate into autoimmune diseases and things of that nature. And I am currently writing for the American Journal of Endocannabinoid Medicine. And I think that's what we're going to be discussing today, an article that we published with them as far as metabolic diseases and possibly treating it via the endocannabinoid system and cannabis.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think everything you really mentioned here is of great interest to the audience that listens to this, especially with kind of the way you look at medicine and focusing on a person as a whole and how everything kind of relates to each other, not just focusing on one specific disease and just targeting that. So, I think a lot of people who consume cannabis or even know people who consume cannabis know that it affects your metabolism in some way, right? Maybe it's because you get the munchies when you consume cannabis. And this is clearly changing the way that we respond to food, how satiated we feel when we eat food. But then I definitely would love to talk about eating disorders. This is something that I've struggled with, and I've kind of used cannabis throughout. I don't have a an eating disorder. I don't struggle with it right now. But when I was in high school and early college, I was a chronic cannabis user and had an eating disorder. And it's a very interesting relationship there that I don't think is talked about enough because of that relationship with appetite stimulation and maybe stimulating like a binge episode. And I think that's really something you only get when you kind of suffer from that or you talk to people who have been through that.
So when we're talking about eating disorders right now, are we talking about overeating or are we talking about more like anorexia and bulimia and these kind of eating disorders?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking about bulimia and anorexia, but I think with bulimia, it's like the binge eating that can be more of a trigger with cannabis consumption. Right. And with anorexia, I think it could be a good therapy to use cannabis to initiate that appetite, but that can very quickly turn bad for people with anorexia because they have such a difficult relationship that if they start eating, it may be difficult for them to stop.
Well, definitely. Let's start there. And I think what most people don't realize, if they've not been suffered with one of these disorders before, or they've only heard about it in passing, is that of all the mental health related issues, that these are actually the most dangerous. These lead to the most amount of deaths from any mental health disorder, more than schizophrenia, more than bipolar disorder, more than pretty much anything you could think of, because between unfortunately, what we see in suicides and malnourishment that leads to other diseases, these things can end tragic. So if cannabis or this endocannabinoid system can help at all to overcome some of these things, it's a very important field that we kind of owe it to society to delve into further and see what the research can say. And I think you're spot on where saying like, one can lead to overeating or the other way, but and that's part of why we need further clinical trials. The research that we have on this is limited. Some of it is from individual case studies, or some of them are from small groups where it might have been 10 participants, 20 participants in a study. So for us to come up with, a definitive answer on these, you would probably need like a randomized controlled clinical trial, with hundreds, maybe thousands of patients over a long period of time to really be able to say, okay, we know for sure this is it. And even still then we might be able to say, okay, well, this is causation, like this is helping, but what's the mechanism of action? That's the even trickier part, and what's part of what we don't know. So theoretically, we do know that cannabis is an appetite modulator, right? Which can help in the anorexia or bulimia. Now, refilling or having the ECS system, the endocannabinoid system, kind of be balanced has also shown to help with a lot of other behaviors that can help kind of offset homeostasis or regulate homeostasis. Everything from self-starvation to binge eating, to its effects on brain-derived neurotropic growth factor that you see also in endocannabinoids. And there's just the reward system that we talked about, how dopamine and serotonin is going to play part of it, and that's all your energy use, your cognitive abilities. It's all part of the equation. I don't think that there isn't any one button we could say, oh, anorexia is caused by A, or bulimia is caused,
or that you can treat it with A or B. Like, it is a very complex
100%.
And you're saying like the mental health aspect is the most difficult part, right? It's not just like, here's this medicine. It's like, here's this medicine. It's going to cause you to want to eat, very likely, and then it's the mental health portion of that, saying like you need to allow yourself to eat and you need to be able to stop eating as well, which is all part of the same thing.
Yeah, and unfortunately the system is not really set up to support that, right? Mental health, you got the two aspects. You got the psychotherapy, which is they're going to talk you to death about it, which is very useful, and there's clinical research that shows psychotherapy is effective, but it's not effective for everybody for all things. And there's a large portion of the population that they've done psychotherapy for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and it's still not working, or it's still not getting them to where they need to be. So we know that's not the end all be all answer for everything, and neither is medication, right? Because we have these drugs, whether it be cannabis or something else that could stimulate the appetite or suppress the appetite, but that doesn't fix the problem either. Nor does the psychotherapy and the drugs put together, it still doesn't fix a problem for some people. So, statistically, I think we just need to increase and kind of creep up and up and up towards the percentages of successful outcomes and measures that we can derive. And along the way, hopefully, we'll be able to, I guess, note or specify more mechanisms of action. But it's a challenging and it's a super, super interesting field. And going back to the mental health aspect of it, nobody knows, you can look at it almost like an autoimmune disease, right? Nobody knows for sure why we have mental health issues. And some people it might be easy. And sometimes in my field, sometimes it's a lot easier than you think. Sometimes it's something simple like maybe their ECS system is deficient or overloaded. And maybe they are just dehydrated. Maybe they are actually malnourished on protein. Maybe they have a vitamin B6 deficiency or a B12 deficiency or a vitamin D deficiency. Maybe they just need some exercise. Maybe they need all these things, plus the psychotherapy and the medication, and maybe that solves it. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah,
that's where it gets tricky.
It is a complicated story. And I mean, there is we have a lot of missing evidence, right? But we have clear scientific studies that link the ECS and metabolic conditions. We know that
100%.
Right. We know that our circulating endocannabinoids are elevated right before we eat a meal, and then they typically go back down. So they're clearly involved in hunger signaling. We know that with obese people, they have higher levels of circulating endocannabinoids. So there's definitely a link here with the ECS being involved in signaling our brain saying, okay, you're hungry, you're full. And when we use cannabis products, the THC is usually kind of mimicking one of those endocannabinoids, right? And kind of initiating that hunger as well. But the story it's much more complicated than that because, tolerance plays a huge role, but there's also other cannabinoids too that I hope we have the chance to talk about, like, THCV and the difference between THC and THCV. Before we get into that, is this kind of part of what you do at your practice, is kind of helping people with different types of cannabis and like explaining different compounds, or do you use like other herbs and other products with metabolism? Just kind of a side note.
So bits and pieces, and when it comes to specific compounds or specific THC molecules or CBD molecules, sometimes I actually refer that out. We have some people that I work with that I'll refer out to that might be much more specialized at it than I am. I think my role is kind of look at the person, like we said, holistically, and look at all these factors. Like, could it possibly be this? Could it possibly be this? Let's run these additional lab tests that your general primary or even the ER or even your specialist isn't running because they're just not part of their standard operating procedures or not what they're looking for. So there's a lot of specialty tests I use, everything from stool sample testing to urine tests to heavy metals and hormones and mold and all sorts of things that can contribute to all these, rare autoimmune diseases, cancers, to mental health disorders that are all part of the picture. And sometimes it actually turns out to be very simple. I mean, I've had people come in and they've had this condition sometimes 20 years, 30 years, and they've been on medications and infusions and then everything. And sometimes we can resolve it very quickly with just the right nutrients or the right detox. And there is no one size fits all. Unfortunately, that's how the conventional medical system is. It is a one size fits all. You have this diagnosis, you get this ICD code, this is the treatment. Doesn't work, we'll try another drug. Doesn't work, we'll just double the dosage. Doesn't work, we'll triple the dosage, right? And then you end up getting a lot of side effects. The interesting thing for me with the endocannabinoid system is, and as the more I learn about it, the more I want to learn about it, is the fact that it affects every part of your system, and it's found in every cell. It affects everything from homeostatic regulation to metabolism, appetite, energy expenditure, how we're actually burning energy, your mood, all your hormones, your immune system, pain response, and even inflammation. So all those different aspects also play a role in obesity and metabolism, right? Inflammation. I've seen patients that sometimes, we'll put them on an anti-inflammatory diet or we'll run them through a detox, and sometimes they'll drop 10, 15 pounds within a few weeks, and it's not even fat, it's just inflammation. It was like just some kind of bloating or some kind of process that they had, and it's incredible. So I think the endocannabinoid system is a huge part of that, and I do use CBD and refer out for THC products and things like that. But I am not the expert on the specific strains and the specific molecules. And actually, I'm sure I could learn a lot from you about that.
No worries. No, I was just gonna bring up something really interesting that kind of fits with
Please.
what you're talking about, of looking at systems as a whole and trying to understand that, like, when you affect one part of your ECS, it has a wave effect. It's going to affect so many other things. You can't just target one thing. And this is a great example of the story of Rimonabant. Are you familiar with that drug?
A little bit, but please share.
Rimonabant was a drug that was introduced as a cannabinoid 1 receptor antagonist.
Correct.
So it was supposed to work essentially in the opposite way of THC. And researchers said, okay, well, if THC makes people hungry, clearly gives people the munchies, then if we had a drug that worked in the opposite way, it would make people skinny, right? It would make people not want to eat. So this drug actually made it through clinical trials, and it never was released in the US, but it was released in Europe. And it did make people want to eat less. It did actually work as an anti-obesity drug, but it also made people extremely suicidal, because you cannot just target one component of the ECS. You can't just say, I'm going to hit that CB1 receptor and it's just going to make people not want to eat. Absolutely not. Yes, that is an effect, but you also have a extreme amount of downstream effects that are often unpredictable in this system, and that unpredictability was suicidality, unfortunately, in this case, and it was removed, from the pharmacopoeia at that point as a drug. But that's just kind of a story of why we shouldn't mess with the ECS in that way. And this other molecule I was talking about, THCV, it's very, very similar in structure to THC, but it kind of works in a similar, like, as an antagonist, similar to Rimonabant, but different enough that it doesn't have those side effects, that mental health side effects we were talking about. And THCV has clinical data showing that it actually does make people want to eat less, and it does act as a, I don't want to say, I don't want to say in a drug-like way, but it does suppress appetite, at least short term. But also, fun fact, CBD counteracts the effects of THCV.
Right.
So when they're in combination, it does not work for suppressing appetite. But THCV alone in 5 milligrams to 10 milligrams has shown to be an effective appetite stimulant. Oops, I meant to say appetite suppressant, not stimulant here. But just a quick recap. THCV has a complicated pharmacological effect on the body. THCV can work as both an agonist and an antagonist on the CB1 receptor depending on the concentration, and also has some agonistic activity on the CB2 receptor. So rather than turning on the cannabinoid 1 receptor like THC does, which makes us feel high and also hungry, it typically turns off this receptor. Of course, this is an oversimplification here, but just a 2-carbon difference on the tail of this molecule compared to THC makes it act in a completely different way and has been proven to lessen appetite. THCV products can be found in gummy, tincture, or isolate form, or if you prefer flower, strains like Durban Poison are pretty well known for having higher levels of THCV, and breeders are now focusing on producing more strains dominant in this compound. So I just love your view of that, because I always talk about just like systems as a whole, and like the ECS is involved in everything, and we cannot simplify it. We just can accept we don't know everything, but we cannot simplify it to that degree.
It's super interesting, and I just learned some really cool stuff from you. I'm familiar with the drug, the first one. It's been linked to do some of the research, but I didn't know the whole story behind it. So that's thank you for sharing that. And correct, anytime you put anything into your body, there's always going to be a downstream effect. And as a herbalist, the way we were trained initially is you don't take medicine that you don't need, right? Even if it's very low, even if it's herbs, even if it's natural, even if it's a low amount of side effects. Now, obviously, we know with THC and with cannabis, people are going to self-medicate to some extent, and perhaps they do need it. And a lot of us are going to be deficient because of the environment, because of our stress levels, because of lack of sleep, because of the quality of the food. So I think there is a time and a place for it. But for me, I think also part of the problem is the way And this is how conventional medicine and the pharmaceutical industry is always going to go about this. They're always going to try to find the molecule and concentrate that times 1,000 and patent it and make a medication on it because that's what's profitable. But as you see with some of these herbs behind me, part of the reason that we worked, and part of the reason even with the cannabis, I typically think, a full spectrum real blend is going to be typically better than these isolated molecules, because that's just the way it was done in nature. And from an Eastern medicine perspective, rarely do we use a single herb in high dosages. Usually it'll be a formula where the blend is going to be synergistic. So you might decide one herb is your king herb. So maybe cannabis or whatever, or maybe dongwei or mint is going to be your main herb for the formula, and then you're going to have a couple supporting herbs and a couple that kind of just help carry it and get it to where it needs to go, and they'll make them like that. That way it reduces the chances for side effects. It reduces the risks rather than taking a super high herb, because some herbs are toxic, right? And they might be okay at low levels, and they might be okay for short-term usage. But a lot of that is lost when we look at the Western paradigm. And we know, if we look at cannabis historically, right, we know it came from the East, right? They were using it for, long history, thousands of years, ancient China, Egypt, right? It's well documented. So
absolutely,
their practices were obviously very different than what's going on with these types of clinical trials. And the mindset is different, and it's very difficult to explain the cultural context behind some of this stuff. And I think it's important. And this is one of these things we see in psychedelics too, right? We see a big move to kind of medicalize and make everything very pharmaceutical orientated. But when you take out the communal aspect, when you take out the traditions, the history, and even the preparation of these herbs, you may or may not get the same effect. It may be better, it may be a lot worse, but there's always going to be people that suffer. But the systemic effect, even in hormone retreatment placement, right? This is, or when people they're going to see the specialist, or they go see a psychiatrist, and they're giving them benzos and Valium or Xanax or Lexapro, whatever it is, and they're not considering the metabolic system. Well, it's like your gut. We know now your enteric nervous system is sending 5 times the amount of information from your gut to your brain than your brain is sending to your gut. So obviously that's going to have an effect on your cognitive abilities, on your mental health. So we can't discount that and pretend that these specialists and these systems don't work together, because it's impossible, right? If you we do hormone therapy in the clinics, and I always tell people, like, make sure this is what you want to do first. Or let's say a young person comes in and they want to do testosterone therapy, right? It's like, okay, that's fine, but have you done the natural things first? Have you tried, natural herbs? Have you tried cleaning up the diet? Have you tried exercise? Because once you start taking it, you're essentially telling your body, we've got plenty of this. No, thank you. There's no reason to make any more. And then what else does that affect, like you brought up? And some of that is unknown.
Yeah, and I mean, I love your approach to it too. With psychedelics, but with other herbs too. There's a lot of supplements that now come in pill form, and I'm just like a big advocate for buying, not just taking the pill, because I agree that you don't really like think about your health as a whole when you're just kind of taking a pill and carrying on. I think it's important to have a little bit of intention, and for some medicines to take a bit of time, or to require that community aspect instead of everything just being as quick as possible, because I think that's part of what's causing so much disease. Is like everything needs to be as quick as possible, which is making our food unhealthy and making us unhealthy and just making our society like on edge. So I love that you talked about that.
I love that you brought up intention. I'm going to run this back to the Eastern medicine again.
Please do.
There's a saying in traditional Chinese medicine that the yi guides the qi. The yi is your intention, or your wisdom, your intuition, your spirit, and it's basically where you want your energy to go. You're going to use your intention to kind of guide it there. So I think you're right. And I have a friend who teaches traditional tea ceremonies and tea, and she's very into mindful eating and mindful drinking your tea, and just really slowing down and doing every part of that. And you're right. Everything from acid reflux and digestive issues, part of it, sometimes even if the food is healthy, if you're eating it too fast, you're going to create a problem, because the chewing process, just doing this, is what's actually going to stimulate release of digestive enzymes. That's what's telling your brain there's food going in my tummy. And if you just a whole 12-inch, sub in 10 seconds, that's not going to sit right. It's going to be very difficult to break that up.
100%. And I think that also goes back to eating disorders, where it's like, it's not a medicine that's going to save you. It's not like a specific food that's going to save you. It's like learning like the intention of eating, and that food is your medicine, and it's feeding your cells, it's feeding your brain, it's feeding your gut, it's feeding your health. And like really grasping your head around that and trying to care about your health more than anything else is like, for me at least, that was the only way I really like got over that and learned to eat correctly and learn to respect food. So I really think that it has a component in all medicine, and like also learning to just listen to your body. It's such an art form. It's very, very, very difficult. And I do think that cannabis consumption can help you listen to your body. It can kind of really help be more in touch with your emotions and your mental state, and like really listening to what your brain has to say. I don't know if that's quantifiable in any realm, but at least from my experience and my friends' experience, it's definitely had healing aspects for us.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And I don't know if it is quantifiable. And back to the Eastern part of it, I practice Qigong, which is like Tai Chi, but specifically for health and wellness. And the Qi is more or less the energy of the body, which is as scientific as it gets. Your body's full of different energetic complexes and chemical reactions and literal electricity.
Your neurons are literally sending electricity.
Literally, right? So anybody that argues that is kind of silly. And the gong part of it, and the same gong is what you hear in Gong Fu or Kung Fu. Gong literally means work. And you don't get the benefits without doing the work. So to think you're going to bypass eating properly or eating healthy or doing some sort of movement, it does, not everybody needs to do CrossFit. But to think you're somehow separate from our ancestors, depending what you believe on in evolution and whatever else, but from everybody that's come before us, and you're going to have this completely different lifestyle. And now part of that is because we've been trained to that. We've been trained to, you just do as you're told, and if you have a problem, do what the doctor tells you. Whatever the doctor tells you, you take this pill, problem solved. And unfortunately, some of that mentality still exists in the doctors. And part of it is you're not going to save everybody. That's one of the frustrating things, right? Especially when we're watching a friend or a family member go through it.
Yeah.
And especially if you've been through it personally, right? And now you're trying to pass on that knowledge. You can only lead the horse to water. But I think, if we were to re-educate or educate the doctors and the medical professionals to make sure they were referring out, I could tell you personally and professionally, probably 80% of all the chronic disease that I see, and from all the practitioners that I know, a lot of it is very basic stuff that can be fixed through metabolic changes, through exercise, diet. And you're talking about every disease across the board, from rheumatoid arthritis to thyroid disease to chronic fatigue to fibromyalgia. 80% of this stuff can be cured. I'll say it because I've done it, and I've got hundreds of videos from patients proving it, and hundreds and hundreds of reviews of successful cases, and thousands of cases that I've personally seen, and from my mentors and everybody else. Like, most of our diseases are reversible and preventable, but you do have to do the work.
Have to do the work. Yep. I love that. Would you mind giving a 30,000 foot overview, or as much detail as you want, of your recent publication in AJEM, and then we'll just kind of continue talking about that paper, about metabolism?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Sure. Yes. So it was basically just discussing the potential for treatment of obesity, of metabolic diseases, and eating disorders through the endocannabinoid system, whether it be THC and CBD. And what we found, to many people's dismay, is that people who were cannabis users or who had a fuller endocannabinoid system, despite having the munchies that we're all very well aware of, actually had lower rates of obesity and lower BMI than people who were not. So this is kind of turns upside down the mindset and what we've been trained to believe, and the feeling that we experience with use. So we can go into a little bit of the details in that. We do need some more research on it, but more or less that was it. It was just some of the mechanisms of actions discussing how and why is it possible. And it was a literature review, basically, that was done on all these studies. I mean, there might have been 19 or more studies just in one of the articles that I reviewed, particularly for this, that were actually measuring, different components of body weight and BMI, and they were all across the board. It wasn't one large study, so we didn't have all of it as clinically controlled as we'd like, and we don't know. I think you had asked earlier in some of the questions, did it matter if it was, vaping or smoking or edibles or liquid or tinctures, right? And unfortunately, we don't know the answers to that because every study would have been different. Some of it might have just been observational studies. It really varied across the board. There was really too many studies to list. Even if you read through all of them, there weren't any huge ones that could have told you the exact mechanism of action or how, but what they found out that it was somehow, even though we know you are increasing your appetite, the BMI and the obesity was less. Things that we were finding out that cholesterol was coming down, that somehow by having a balanced endocannabinoid system, they were showing triglyceride levels were reduced. They were showing insulin and glucose response was better than in people who weren't. So there's a bunch of different theories of it. Part of it they're thinking is, in some of the theories where that maybe cannabis could possibly increase your appetite, but then when you're not smoking, right, maybe you're eating less during those periods, and that helps drop the weight a little bit, right? Part of it might have been that the cannabis, some of maybe the anti-inflammatory aspects of the cannabis and the endocannabinoids could be reducing the amount of inflammation, which could then be reducing metabolic disease and helping fix some of your glucose and your insulin pathways that way. That's another theory that's getting floated out there. Part of it is the possible omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, where the omega-3s are the healthy fats that actually have a lot of health benefits that we see, people are taking their fish oil for, everything from inflammation to hormones, to regulating sleep, to lubricating the joints, to cognitive function, all these kinds of things that we see, statins and other things actually depleting from the systems that are necessary for our survival. And we see that even within, you get that even from eating hemp seeds, right? You get a nice dose of omegas and protein. So part of that protection and might be associated for that. And I think those are probably the main theories. We could go into a lot more details, but we've seen in some of these cases that the instances of fatty liver was less. Oxidization was less with the fatty acids. So everything from liver health to pancreatic health to inflammation to omega-6, omega-3 balances to appetite and how satiated we are, to our actual reward centers, dopamine. It's all part of it, which it's just what makes this so interesting. Also to how we're increasing our energy expenditure, like how many calories we're actually burning or while we're doing the activities. And right now, unfortunately, I think there's too many variables in all those different studies to come out to any hard conclusions. But this causation is definitely there. It's a fact. We see in multiple studies. So a lot of this was based on meta-analysis. So this is many studies that were put together for the study to come up with this research. So,
and honestly, I feel like that's almost as good as a massive clinical trial, because you have all of these different researchers finding similar findings, and to me that's almost better than having one researcher who might have done something incorrectly and had skewed results. Instead, it's like you give 20 people a chance to do a research study, and if you have the same results with all of those, that's a pretty clear causation.
So for causation, 100%, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because part of the process of doing a meta-analysis is you're actually going to disqualify some of the studies you found that maybe the evidence in here is a little weak, or maybe this could have been a little biased. So that's part of the process. So yes, meta-analysis along with RCTs is considered to be, higher up in the echelon of quality of clinical trials and kind of what we're looking for. So there is strong evidence to suggest, there's evidence, facts that this stuff is happening, it is working. We just need to, for scientific purposes, and to be able to develop further drugs and to be able to develop, I guess, more effective treatment protocols rather than, I don't know, try vaping, try a tincture, try THCV, try, whatever, CBN, right? To get clear outcomes for that's why we're really going to need to do the large scale clinical control trials. For me personally, as a clinician, a lot of that stuff doesn't matter. On the science side, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's important to push this forward and to get wider acceptance from other doctors. But for me, I'm still in the clinic a few days a week, and on top of my other business responsibilities and research stuff that I'm into. So when I'm seeing a patient, as long as it works for my patient, I do not care. I don't care what the labs say. I don't care about any of that stuff. If the patient is telling me they're getting better, they feel better, they look better, their family's happy, they're happy, then it's working, and mechanism of action is not even an afterthought for me.
I love that. Because, patient first perspective. If it's helping them, then why would you change anything? Why do you need anything else? Now, during your meta-analysis, did you see a relationship with the age of the cannabis consumer and metabolic conditions? Because I think there was a paper that came out in 2022 it was only a mouse study, so it was not in humans, but it was looking at, essentially, let me back up one more step, actually, because in the cannabis world, there's this thing called the skinny hippie hypothesis, which is exactly what you're talking about. Like, stoners were always skinny, and everyone's like, why is that? And of course, that's not true for 100% of people,
right.
But you see trends, right? So this paper that was published essentially had adolescent mice and adult mice. And when the adolescent mice were chronically fed THC, they found that they did end up that kind of skinny phenotype. But the adult ones, when they were chronically fed THC, they didn't really see that correlation. And when they did the actual protein analysis and looked at the different tissues, they found that the proteins that were being expressed in that fat tissue were not normal ones being produced. Instead, they were like skeletal and muscle tissue being produced. So that's one study that I'm familiar with, but I'm just curious on like a human-based level if we've seen any sort of correlation there, or if we just don't know yet and this is still kind of a big question mark.
It's a great question, and I've seen bits and pieces, but overall, you're correct. There's not enough info on that there too. I've seen some that kind of hypothesize as maybe older folks, maybe the ECS is already more full, or maybe younger folks have a higher energy expenditure, or maybe they're more active, or and they could burn, as we know, right, our metabolism slows down as we age, right? So part of it just might be natural. I don't think there's enough data. Like you said, there's a couple studies that were done on humans, not enough of them, and they weren't large scale. So I don't know that we'd be able to draw any conclusions of that. I have seen the study you're speaking of, and I've seen some other mice studies where they talked about older versus younger mice, but nothing concrete enough that I would really like to say, oh, for sure we could say this is going to work for young folks and not for older folks. And even though mice are close enough relatives of ours, we know from other drugs that have been produced, just because it works on a mouse or a chimp or a dog does not necessarily mean it's going to have the same effect on humans.
Correct. Yeah, 100%. Okay, I'd be interested to learn that in the future, and I wonder if we will have that answer someday. So back to this paper. You introduced it as essentially talking about cannabis as a potential treatment for eating disorders, metabolic conditions, and obesity. So let's bring up obesity as an example here. Like, if we were trying to treat somebody who was obese and didn't want to be obese anymore, where do we think we're going in that realm?
So some of this was on mice studies, but what they found on some of this is they actually found that with CBD, the mice that were treated with CBD, they actually had improved glucose tolerance and increased markers of lipid metabolism, adipose, and liver tissues. So they were able to burn fat faster and kind of deal with blood sugar and insulin and fatty livers and things like that with the CBD. I'm sorry, that was a THC, but with the CBD, it didn't affect the weight gain and the fatty liver as much. But they've also found other studies that have documented that actually triglyceride levels will come down. So triglycerides is a cholesterol marker, right? And that's how you're actually storing sugar into fat, right? So, and one of the common misconceptions with cholesterol, and to be clear, this whole podcast, we're not giving medical advice. This is for education and informational purposes.
Thank you. Yes.
Right? But they've there aren't any definitive studies that I've actually seen that LDL, which is your bad cholesterol alone, is actually bad for you. Okay? There is documentation providing that both high triglycerides and high LDLs does increase your risk of heart disease and does increase your risk for having blocked arteries and things like that. So, and one of the interesting things that actually wasn't mentioned in this particular research, but is coming back to me now, and in regards to another question that you had that we'll get into in a few, was we know with CBD and THC, it does have a little bit of a blood thinning effect too. So maybe it's thinning some of the fat out, and maybe that's one of the ways. And this is my hypothesis based on this right now. Maybe it's just anti-inflammatory. If it's allowing the arteries and the veins to kind of relax and let blood be less viscous and let fat be less viscous as well. Maybe it's somehow breaking it up and bringing the inflammation down. So if we're bringing down the way we handle insulin and blood glucose, so we're not storing it into fat and into triglycerides, and it's actually reducing our triglyceride levels, right? And fixing our I think the glucose and the insulin is probably going to be one of the biggest things for me. And to go back to my initial doctorate research was on diabetic neuropathy. And what I came to find from a nerve, which is a little different from the obesity, but what I found, and we all know that, right, sugar is bad, sugar is evil, right? But why? What does it do to the body? Besides the metabolic issues, besides storing fat, and besides damaging everything else, what I found from the nervous system, and we can tie this back into this a little bit because we talked a little bit about the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, right? Every time your blood sugar spikes, your nerves, all your nerves, literally begin to disintegrate and crumble and die, right? So when we talk about psychedelics or lion's mane or learning new activities, brushing your teeth with your left hand or whatever it is, which can actually increase BDNF and increase neuroplasticity and possibly help with neurogenesis, right? Every time we're spiking our blood sugar, it's killing our nervous system, which will also affect, right? So if you see a lot of times gastroparesis in diabetics, right? And then they have constipation, and then they get bloated, and then they get maybe obese because they're not eliminating properly, right? Because your blood sugar is too high, your vagus nerve is dying. It's not telling your stomach and your bowels to empty, and then you're not getting a peristalsis going, which is little microvilli, the little hairs in your intestines that basically work like dominoes. Once they start going, they all start going. But your nerves need to tell it, right? And that's why the diabetics go blind and get neuropathy, and the men get ED and all these things, because the glucose is actually killing your nervous system. So I think, once again, it's a combination of all these things: the blood sugar, the glucose, the fat, the inflammation, which is really going to help on the obesity side of it.
Wow, thanks for sharing your past research. I didn't know that, and that's specific to a spike in glucose. So low levels of sugar, if you just have like natural sugars or you just kind of keep it low and slow, not necessarily terrible for your brain. But if you're taking in a lot of sugar and there's a lot circulating through your body, then that's kind of where it becomes neurotoxic.
Correct. And probably 98% of Americans are taking in way too much sugar. Low blood sugar is also a problem. And we see that in a clinic as well. Hypoglycemia will also kill you. Hypoglycemia will often cause fatigue, chronic headaches. Hypoglycemia will cause no appetite in the morning. And then so you might think you're intermittent fasting, but then you end up binging later. And then you go and binge on the high carb foods, which is exactly the opposite of what you need. But what most people don't realize is that there is sugar added in every single processed food has sugar added. If you get a salad, it's got sugar added to it. If you get a drink, there's sugar in it, right? And the alcohol converts into sugar too. If you're eating fruit, it's fructose. That's sugar. That's healthy for you, but there's a limitation. I had a patient come in one time, and she was mid-60s, very poor health, and a bunch of different autoimmune conditions, all sorts of problems. And I got into her diet, and she was raw vegan, and she was eating 14 bananas a day.
14 bananas.
14 bananas. So she wasn't eating any sugar, according to her. But obviously it wasn't working well for her. So
That's crazy.
Here's the thing, right? Our body, the recommended daily allowance for sugar, the RDA, is about 30 grams, maybe 35 grams of sugar. So if you have one Gatorade, right, or one, even if you're relatively healthy, or if you have a couple pieces of fruit and one piece of toast, you're already at your limit. But then you're gonna have a cookie and a little piece of chocolate, and then you had a rice, and then or some pasta, and you had a sandwich, and carbs. Right? There's an enzyme called amylase, and the second a carbohydrate touches your tongue, you're already converting it into sugar, and that's part of the problem that we see with cannabis users, and maybe that's part of the problem with the ones that are obese that aren't getting these benefits, is maybe they're just having a hard time differentiating which snacks or what they should be eating, or maybe they're just making poor decisions, because we know, like, we'll go for chips or crackers or bread or other things that give you that quick high because they have the sugar added, and you're getting that natural sugar, and then that's going to contribute to higher triglyceride levels. That's going to contribute to spiking your blood sugar. Where what I recommend to people usually is like, if it's late at night and you're hungry, right? If you do have to eat something sweet, try for fruit, try something natural, right? Don't do ice cream, because it's the worst thing you're going to do, right? It's sugar and dairy, and it's cold, all things that aren't good for your system, and it's super addictive, right? Or have one date a day, right? Actually, 1 or 2 dates is almost enough sugar for the entire day, and it's very sweet. So I think part of it is to trick your body psychologically into actually, so you're getting the physical requirements, because you need that certain amount of sugar, right? And then you just you can get over the cravings, the physiological cravings, if you've already had your fill of your sugar requirements. And then I'll tell people to do things like, and once again for informational purposes, eat nuts and seeds, as long as you don't have any sort of like Crohn's disease or colitis or some kind of problem like that. But some cashews, some walnuts, some or things like that maybe at night, because they're very filling. They have healthy omegas, right? Just like the endocannabinoid stuff, so they're going to go well together, and they actually have protein, healthy fats. But if you're eating a bunch of chips, once you eat one, you just can't stop.
Yeah, and I think dates are something that people could probably pretty easily regulate their consumption of. I've never wanted to eat 20 dates.
They're way too sweet. Way too sweet.
They're too sweet, and your teeth just hurt. And also, just a life hack for anyone out there: don't grocery shop while you're high, because then you're going to want to buy all of the fun things. But you should just grocery shop when you're already full, you're already satiated, and then you'll buy healthier snacks. I know that from personal experience. Something that I find super interesting as we're talking about the ECS and fat metabolism is something that's so special about the ECS, not just that it's a retrograde signaling system, so it's working in the opposite direction of your other signaling systems, but it's a fat signaling system. I don't know if anyone out there listening or you have actually worked with the molecules or the plant, but it's very unique because they're so fatty. And typically in natural products, when we're working with drug-like molecules, we're working with things that are much more polar, much more like medium polar. But cannabinoids are very fatty molecules, both the endocannabinoids and the phytocannabinoids, the ones in the plant. And the actual fat tissue in the body has high levels of cannabinoid receptors. I think as far as like the peripheral system in the body, the fat is like just behind like the stomach as far as the level of cannabinoid receptors. So there's obviously something happening here with your endocannabinoids that are signaling whether you're hungry or satiated, the metabolism of these fats, these receptors located in this fatty tissue, and in how this energy system works in our body. But kind of what you're saying and what your research is really helping fill a gap for is we don't know exactly how that system's working, but we know the system is heavily integrated into the fat system of our body. And because of that fat signaling system, and because of the role of these cannabinoids, like in the actual membranes of our body, which are also made of fats, you know, there's something happening here, whether it's increasing the permeability through the actual cells, whether we're actually like if these active compounds are able to get into cells better and that helps metabolism. There's like a billion theories that you could start thinking about when you start thinking about energy systems and fat metabolism. And then you start thinking about like tolerance. And yes, we have tolerance to compounds like THC, but sorry, I'm going straight theory right now. I've never even thought about this before, but if people who are obese are producing excess endocannabinoids, you know, you would think that you would build some sort of tolerance in your actual fat tissues of reducing the receptor levels. And I wonder if that has something to do with, you know, the processing and kind of having like a treatment resistant obesity, at least for a short amount of time until you're able to kind of work out that component of tolerance. Did this sound like gibberish or am I making any sense?
No, that was actually very beautifully well said. And I think it's true. And I think part of the problem and what maybe some users or listeners will have a hang up on is when you keep running the word fat, right? And clinically, we would call them lipids, so right, like hyperlipidemia would be, hypercholesterol, right? But I think part of the problem is we've kind of demonized the word fat, and we need healthy fats to survive. You need fats, you need cholesterol, right? Fatty vitamins like like what we see in the ECS system, but also vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. We cannot live without these vitamins. We will be kaput, right? And what we briefly spoke about earlier with the statins, everybody getting put on statins, a lot of times prematurely and a lot of times unnecessarily, where they're not even actually doing like a carotid artery exam or a coronary heart scan to see if they really do have plaque or not. Then why are you putting people on this drug that's going to lower their healthy fats out of their system too? And we're seeing a lot of dementia come out of that, and other muscular pains and things like that. And going back to the glucose, that's another one we see now too, is Alzheimer's are actually renaming or nicknaming type 3 diabetes, because they found out that even if you're not diabetic, people who have Alzheimer's and dementia often have the same insulin resistance or problems with glucose metabolism as people that do have diabetes. So they've recently found that, and that's just another way this all ties together. We don't know how the ECS is affecting that, but that's why this kind of research is going to be, I think, the future, one of the better and hopefully one of the less harmful and ways with less side effects to treat hypertension, blood pressure, cholesterol, fatty liver, eating disorders, diabetes, obesity, all this kind of stuff. This is what makes it such a fascinating field, and it's fun to hypothesize on these things and kind of look through and to be able to stereotype people and the skinny hippies and the other one I think that we didn't bring up was that you had put in one of the questions that you sent me about why do people always feel cold.
Oh yeah, we should definitely talk about that and just like thermogenesis in general. Because I think people think that this is just like a theory, like that, oh, you know, people who smoke a lot get cold a lot, but we have some science to support this.
I'm not familiar with the studies on it.
Okay.
Why don't you give me? No, I have some theories too, though. But give me your take on it and what you've seen on the research, and I'd love to see if it kind of aligns with what I was thinking.
I'm not an expert in this, but I did see one research paper that that essentially said that THC can inhibit thermogenesis, which is essentially your body using your fat to create heat. So if you're not able to create that heat on your own, then you feel cold. And this wasn't like an in-depth study. This was just a couple sentences in a different study. But I believe that. I mean, I'm always cold and I'm often using cannabis. But I'd love to hear your theory too. And I will also try to find that research paper and attach it to the show notes so other people can read on that too.
So I love that you brought that into the conversation, and it definitely ties directly into the conversation we're already having, because that goes back to energy expenditure, which is one of these things here that we're talking about, right? Your burning energy is creating fuel on that. However, from clinical experience and working on both the Eastern side and on the functional medicine side, I'd like to say it's not always that simple, because there's so many other factors that are going to be part of that equation, right? What's your thyroid functioning like, right? Are you borderline anemic, or are you anemic, all right? Are you moving enough? Are you sitting in a chair all day? How's your circulation, right? So all these things I think will be equally important. What's the climate that you live in? What's the temperature of the room that you're in? What climate were you born in? Where are your ancestors from, right? All that plays a huge role in how you experience temperature as a person, right? And when you're saying cold, are you having cold sweats? Are you a little chilly? Is it just your hands and feet? Is it just the fingertips and the toes? Or is it the whole body? So there's a lot to it. And honestly, you could do a whole episode, I think, just on that. So I think definitely part of it is going to be with the energy expenditure. I think that makes sense. And we do have some research on that, right? And the other thing that we talked about briefly earlier was about the THC or CBD possibly thinning the blood a little bit too, right? So if you're the person that is already, and I see this a lot, very often, I know my wife is one of them, and I have women that come in very often. It's more common in women to be borderline anemic, but there's a lot of underlying variations of anemia that most people don't realize. There's like 20 different types of anemia, and most people are only most doctors don't know that. And nor do they check for any of them usually. They're only looking at for the most part, your complete blood count, and if your red blood cells and hemoglobin are okay, they usually don't bother checking for iron. Iron is not a good indicator either. You really need your ferritin levels to check to see how you're storing and how you're utilizing the iron within the body. So, and then there's reticulocyte counts and B12 and folate and all these things will all play a role in that. So, I think it's a much broader question. So, cool. I think the thermogenesis and the energy expenditure is definitely a component of it. But once again, we need to start thinking as a society about a multi-systems approach, which is how indigenous or traditional cultures did their medicine from the very beginning. It's really only the last couple hundred years where we've discarded thousands of years of knowledge and said, we're going to use these chemicals to, the shotgun effect. We're going to give you the highest doses possible and blast you one way, and let's hope it works and it doesn't kill you.
I love that approach, like especially talking about genetics and talking about your environment and talking about the different parts of your body experiencing that. And, a lot of people do use cannabis and they do go sit down somewhere, and that may make them cold too if they're just kind of sitting, not moving. And this also kind of reminds me of just a lot of things I've been seeing on the internet, which make me really, really happy to see, is people starting to realize that these different mental health conditions, these different conditions that they're experiencing, they're kind of bringing into context, well, we're animals and we're staring at a screen for 14 hours a day, and then we're experiencing negative effects in our mental health and our well-being. And it's like, well, were we meant to do this all day? Just sit and stare at a screen? Like, probably not. Like, we need to make sure that we're exercising.
The science is very clear on that. 100% not. We're
Right.
not meant to that. The body is not designed for that. It will kill you. That's why they say sitting is the new smoking.
100%.
We could do a whole episode on just how bad that is for you. I mean, we could go for hours.
Well, you can feel it too. I remember when I was writing my dissertation, so I was sitting a lot, and I literally was getting sore. I was getting really sore from sitting all day, and I was like, I need to get a standing desk or go for a run halfway through the day, because it feels terrible. But I also want to make sure that I'm not taking up too much of your time, so we can start to wrap up this episode. But something that you've brought up a couple times and that I've experienced too, I have migraines, and I'm starting to get a grip on what helps my migraines. But, when I went to the doctor and was talking to her about my migraines, she was so quick to whip out that pad and start writing me a prescription for these migraine medications. And I was like, oh no, like I'm not comfortable with that. Can I get a blood test first? And like, we can start to work through it in that way. But this is something you've been talking about. So like, if people wanted to be advocates for their own medicine and their own health, and maybe their doctor, they don't feel like their doctor is doing them justice with the treatment that they're getting, what are some ways that you would suggest people advocate for their health? And like, would it be seeing like a doctor like you, or would it be asking for specific tests, or like, what is the process like to kind of get better answers rather than just a prescription pad?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that's one of the most damaging bits of our society right now. And that's, like I said earlier, is doctors need to start referring out to people who can help, right? Whether it be another functional medicine doctor, or an acupuncturist, or a nutritionist, or a dietitian, or a personal trainer, or a chiropractor, or whatever it is, based on their personal beliefs. They're nothing against doctors, because they were trained to do a certain thing and they're very good at what they do, right?
Yeah.
But what they do is not fix problems. They give you these drugs to kind of mask your symptoms. Now, if you're having an emergency, or if you have some kind of life-threatening condition, I don't want any of this stuff, right? I don't want needles. If I got in a car accident, please get the jaws of life, airlift me, put me back together, right? And I've been there on the patient side myself, and that's kind of how I got into this as well, to doing it professionally, because I was so frustrated. And this is the story I hear every single day, and it's sickening, because these people come in and I've been dealing with this for 2 years or 20 years, and I've seen a dozen specialists, and I've been all over the country or all over the world, and all these doctors keep telling me, oh, it's all in my head, or it's anxiety, or just keep popping these pills and pills and pills, and I keep taking more pills, and I just keep getting worse and worse, and they just keep giving me more pills. Right? It's the most frustrating thing in the world. The fact is, you nailed it. You do have to advocate for yourself. And if your doctor is not hearing you, and if none of the doctors are hearing you, you're going to have to think out the box, and you're going to have to invest in yourself a little bit. I think part of the hesitation is people are like, oh, if it's not covered by insurance, it's only going to get you so far. I mean, would I love to be able to treat everybody covered by insurance? Absolutely. Unfortunately, the system is what it is, and we have to work within those guidelines. So sometimes, if you have to invest in yourself, sometimes it's just what you got to do. One, you got to find a practitioner you're comfortable with. Yeah. Two, the thing is, you need to change your mindset a little bit away from the sick care and feeling like the victim, to like, hey, I am gonna advocate for myself. I am gonna take my health and my own responsibility. It isn't a pill or one vitamin or one food that's gonna fix the problem. You might need a whole lifestyle overhaul, right? Lifestyle, mindset, diet. It might be all these things. It might be none of those things, all right? And the most important thing is, if one practitioner doesn't work for you, or if you're not happy with the results, don't give up. Don't give up. There's so many different styles. Like, even within the Eastern medicine, there's got to be 100 different styles of acupuncture. Everything from dry needling to Korean and Japanese and Tibetan and one needle technique and four needle. There's a million different. Functional medicine varies across the board. There's people that are saying they're doing functional medicine, and they're really just doing like hormone therapy and stuff like that. And then there's the people who are going to go really deep into the tests and start looking for, like I said, heavy metal poisoning and Lyme disease, and or it just really, really depends. But yeah, definitely functional medicine is kind of like this integrative approach where we take all that into account. A lot of the questions that we use for diagnostics in functional medicine are eerily similar to what we do in Eastern medicine. That the questions we've been using for thousands of years, right? Because we look at the whole body. When a patient comes into me, I'm asking about their eyesight, their hearing, their congestion, their throat, their bowels, their digestion, their urination. A woman, if it's your cycle, if you're postmenopausal, what was your cycle like to be? Are you hot? Are you cold? Are there hot flashes? Are there night sweats? Are there any pain in any of the organs? Is there any musculoskeletal pain? Tell me the history of these things. How did they start? When did they start? So your general doctor, in 6 minutes, even if you could give them that information, they don't know what to do with it, right? That's not what they were trained to do. They were trained, you give them the symptom, they give you the pill. And unfortunately, most of their ongoing education comes from pharmaceutical sales reps. That's where they're getting they're training for these days. And most doctors, unfortunately, I could tell you from experience of dealing with them, once they've graduated medical school, they're trying to do the least amount of scientific reading as possible. And they want to spend the most amount of time with their families and things they love, whether it be golf or yachting or whatever it is. Not to generalize, but it's just a fact. Most people don't want to do extra homework.
Well, and that is especially pertinent with the ECS and learning about the ECS, because almost no physicians are actually taught about the ECS during medical school. So anything that they learn has to be on their own time. And if you already are subject to like the propaganda of cannabis over the past 50 years, you're probably not even going to do that due diligence, and you are going to continue to stigmatize people who decide to treat themselves with cannabis as medicine. So it's kind of this perpetuating.
They have a negative precondition to it, and thank you for bringing that back in, because that is the whole purpose of this American Journal of Endocannabinoid Medicine, and that's also one of the reasons they tapped me to come in and write for them and do literature reviews and try to break it down into bits and pieces that are more digestible, because the average doctor is not the average researcher.
Yes.
Right. While the average doctor might understand some of the terminology, research terminology is not what we do day to day in a clinical perspective. And a lot of the studies are just way too complicated and way too long. And
you shouldn't be expected to do everything. Like, you cannot physically learn everything. Yeah. So I love that. I love what AJEM's doing to really break down endocannabinoid medicine for everyone. What you're contributing, what so many other people are contributing with the podcast and the blog post and the shorter articles, and just really kind of creating redundancy and making it super accessible, whether you have 5 minutes as a physician or 50 minutes as a physician. Like, you can definitely learn something on AJEM. So they're doing a great job filling that gap.
Exactly. And get your news about cannabis from, respectable sources, and not from, Twitter or headlines, right? Because the media's got their spin on it, and for whatever reason.
I think I've ranted about that.
And backing or financing is behind that.
Yeah, and like the news headlines are always going to be as like polarizing as possible just to get people to read it. So don't
if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so just to finish up here, what are some ways people can contact you, whether it be your email or social media or whatever way that you prefer to be contacted, or not at all if you don't want people to contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to help, and we deal with patients all over. So I agree to always point anybody in the right direction, and I love having these conversations. So I'd be happy to speak to anybody. LinkedIn is an easy way at Jonathan M. Fields, Jonathan, the letter M as in Matthew, Fields, Fields. My main clinical practice in Boca, where we have the anti-aging and functional medicine and all that, is Create Health. And that's just the letter C, the letter R, the number 8, the word health. And you can find that on social media or createhealth.com, CR8 Health. And the Ketamine Wellness Center we're opening up is New Path Mind and Wellness, which is just at New Path Mind. So it's a NEUPATH Mind. And
I will put those in the show notes. And the very last question is, I saw on one of your bios online that you are an artist. And the arts and sciences are deeply intertwined. And I always felt that was super important, at least for me, to exercise these different parts of my brain, because being a better artist made me a better scientist. So I'm just curious what kind of art you create, and if you're just willing to share anything about that, because I think it's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. One, I agree with you. I think it's that curiosity, right? When you're into the science, it's like you're looking for what is there. And from an art perspective, at least from a visual arts perspective, and for other arts or even musical or anything, it's like you're starting with a blank screen or a blank slate, and it's like, what can I make this? Which is similar, kind of the research, right? The methods are very different, but I guess my favorite mediums would actually be painting. I've done works I've had stuff in museums, I've had stuff in galleries, I've done massive murals. Yeah, I've done 80 feet long by 24 feet high murals. And
are you an oil painter?
I've done some oil painting, but I mostly use mixed media, which is typically acrylics, inks, spray paint, different types of things like that. Oil is not very forgiving, and it's very, very slow and time consuming. And I've grown, I guess, less patient and had less time to paint as I've aged. So I've kind of moved away some from oils too. And then my other, I think, main art, which is very different, but is martial arts. I've been in martial arts most of my life. I taught professionally for over 15 years, including UFC fighters to police and fire and all kinds of stuff like that. Now I'm teaching more of the Qigong and Tai Chi stuff for health and wellness. But those are my main two things. My first degree was actually digital media, was for graphic design, computer graphics, and 3D animation and all that kind of stuff. But you can check out some of my stuff if you want at trails1.com. That's TRAILS, the number 1.com.
Oh,
it's old. I probably haven't updated it in like 7 years or so, but there's a lot of content on there. Take a look. Let me know what you think.
Oh, I definitely will.
Yeah, photography, painting, graffiti, all sorts of stuff.
So cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'm an acrylic painter as well,
cool.
So I love that. And just
send me some links.
Oh, mine's not like cool. Like I've never been in.
Love to see it anyway.
Yeah,
you never know.
All right, cool. I'll definitely share some with you as well. But thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I learned so much from you, and I hope that you enjoyed being on here. But yeah, thanks for joining.
I did. I really, really appreciate it. I think what you're doing is amazing. Keep up the good work. I think we need more people like you that are intelligent and can speak about this at an in-depth, like intellectual level, and once again, not make it too complicated where it's above everybody's heads. So, and I definitely learned a few things from you as well. So keep doing the good work, and let's stay in touch, and let me know if I could ever help with anything. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Mad love, my friends. Enjoy your weekend and sending good vibes your way. Catch you next week.